co-sponsorship of DAWN, Democracy for the Arab World Now, and their executive director, Sarah Lee Whitson, who will be introducing DAWN shortly. But first, let me tell you a little bit about the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at Rutgers University, Newark, housed in the Law Center. We are the first civil rights center at a U.S. law school that focuses primarily on the civil and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians in the United States through a cross-racial, interfaith, and transnational approach. Today's lecture discusses or focuses in large part on how what is happening in Palestine not only affects the human rights of Palestinians, but also affects the civil rights of Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, and their allies who believe and support Palestinian human rights. For those of you who are on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, I ask you right now to follow us. RUCSRR on Twitter, RUCSRR on Facebook, and Rutgers CSRR on Instagram. We are proud to be a source of information that brings to light the voices and the perspectives and the experiences of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians, which is a very diverse group of people, both racially, ethnically, and by faith. And in particular, today, we would like to bring the voices of Palestinian Americans, including our distinguished and esteemed guest, Palestinian American professor, Rashid Khalidi. Before I formally introduce him, I would like to share or give the virtual floor to my colleague, Sarah Lee Whitson, to discuss the very important work of DAWN.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Sahad, for your leadership in organizing this really amazing event, and the response and the numbers of registrants, which I see scrolling as I speak, is really so inspiring. And I think the very simple and important reason for that is that we are in a historic moment of shift in public opinion and in the opinion of the foreign policy community about what ails Israel and Palestine, with a very clear focus on the apartheid, on the ethnic cleansing, on the land theft, on the war crimes, and over the past 10 days, the indiscriminate and deliberate bombardment of the population in Gaza. So I thank you all for joining and joining in an opportunity to really dig in and learn more about what this is about. Democracy for the Arab World Now, the organization that I am the executive director of, was founded by Jamal Khashoggi, the slain Saudi journalist. Unfortunately, he was murdered just a few months after he established DAWN, but we have been able to resurrect the organization and, more importantly, Jamal's vision in our work to focus on the essential need for democracy and human rights in the Middle East and North Africa, and very, very specifically on US policies in the Middle East and North Africa that undermine democracy and harm the human rights of the people in the region. Israel-Palestine is one of those places where, of course, billions in annual military aid directly goes to contribute to Israeli war crimes, including war crimes underway now. And so what is happening in American policy vis-a-vis Israel is very, very central to the work of our organization. I hope you will also follow us on Twitter and Facebook, dawnmina.org on our website as well. And I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. And I would be remiss not to mention that I'm a proud board member of DAWN, and I have so much respect for your work and the courageous work that your colleagues do. And before we start, I just want to say that both you and I and Rashid, Dr. Khalidi, and all of us at CSR and DAWN are committed to democracy in the Middle East, human rights in the Middle East, regardless of what state it is, regardless whether it's an Arab state, regardless whether it's Israel, regardless whether it's Iran, regardless whether it's Turkey. And what we focus on is the human rights of all people, regardless of the state and regardless of the majority religion of that state. And so in that spirit today, we are focusing on the human rights of Palestinians. And I have the distinct honor of introducing Dr. Khalidi, and that we will be engaging in a fireside chat where I will be asking him questions and also taking questions from the audience. So Dr. Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University, where he teaches courses such as Middle East, Eastern history, Orientalism, and the historiography of the other, the modern history of Palestine, nationalism in the Arab world, among other classes. He received a BA from Yale University and a PhD from Oxford University, and has previously taught at the Lebanese University, the American University of Beirut, and the University of Chicago. He is a co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies and has served as president of the Middle East Studies Association. Dr. Khalidi was previously an advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid and Washington Arab-Israeli peace negotiations from October 1991 until June 1993. He is the author of 8 books, most recently, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance from 1917 to 2017, and the author of over 100 scholarly articles and book chapters, and has co-edited 3 books. He is also the recipient of many awards, including the WOCMES Seville 2018 Award for Outstanding Contributions to Middle East Studies, the Lionel Trilling Book Award for Brokers of Deceit, published in 2014, the Arab American National Museum Book Award for The Iron Cage, published in 2007, and the academic winner of the MIMO Palestine Book Awards in 2013, among many other distinctions and awards that he has received. And before I turn the floor over to Dr. Khalidi, I just want to put a plug in for his book, which I highly recommend everyone read. That will be the center of our conversation today, although we will be talking about other things as well. So welcome, Professor Khalidi, to the virtual event hosted by CSRR and Dawn. So I'd like to start, before we delve into the history, and you are one of the most renowned historians of Palestine, I want to start the conversation by identifying, by running through the events of the past 4 weeks to explain how we got to where we are today.
I think that we'll be delving into the background. First of all, thank you for having me, Sahad. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks to all who made this event possible, and thanks to everybody who's participating virtually. We're getting used to this weird way of communicating. Certainly I am. I think we're going to be delving into the historical background in a bit through some of your questions. But I think it is actually useful to talk about the events of the past several weeks before this, the extreme violence of the Israeli attacks on Gaza and rocket fire from Gaza into Israel began. Because in the way in which this is usually narrated, and it's an Israeli favored way of doing it, there are sort of perpetual beginnings which start with the first rocket. And that's not where things started. It's not where things started in Gaza. Gaza has been subjected to a siege since 2007. The population of Gaza have basically been imprisoned. Their access to the world has been cut off, and they have been subjected to an incredible blockade as far as all kinds of materials are concerned, from medicine and food to building materials, books, and so forth. That is not irrelevant to what is happening today, nor, in fact, it's one of the major reasons that what is happening today is happening. That siege and that blockade, by the way, began before the first rocket was ever fired from Gaza. So the blockade and siege are not a result of something. This is what I mean about perpetual beginnings. Israel loves to start by talking about a rocket was fired from Gaza. And in fact, we may talk about the indiscriminate fire of rockets from Gaza as a potential war crime, which it probably very likely is. But to understand that in context is absolutely important. So are things like proportionality and the indiscriminate nature of attacks on civilians. But to go to your question, which is, how did we get to where we got in the last week or 10 days? Well, we got there via a series of practices which are not new. Practices of eviction of people from their homes, dispossession of families. In Sheikh Jarrah, for example, which is just one of dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of this happening all over Palestine over many, many decades. In the case of Sheikh Jarrah, the people being dispossessed from a number of families were dispossessed on the basis of property claims by Israeli settler organizations to property in East Jerusalem. These were families which in fact had been dispossessed from their homes in Jaffa and Haifa in 1948. They were not entitled to make claims for their property, which is now inside Israel, whereas these settler groups were being backed by the might of the Israeli state in implementing their claims. So we're talking here about something that takes us actually back to the core of the Palestine problem, which is the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians from what is now Israel 73 years ago, and their dispossession, not just of their homeland, but of their property. So for all Palestinians and for people throughout the Arab world, people who know this background, what happens in Sheikh Jarrah, what has been happening in other neighborhoods like Silwan, around Jerusalem, what happens in other parts of the occupied West Bank is something that touches on a traumatic series of events that goes back more than 3 generations. Similarly, the assaults on the Al-Aqsa Mosque by Israeli security forces. And I have to stress, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built in the 7th century, in the 680s. It is one of the oldest, perhaps the oldest mosque in the world. It is the 3rd holiest place in Islam. It's the first direction of prayer for Muslims. It's the 3rd holiest place. Ula al-Qiblatayn, Thalith al-Haramayn in Arabic. Israeli forces on a Ramadan night, when worshippers were praying, entered the plaza around the mosque, the Haram al-Sharif, the esplanade around the mosque, fired tear gas, and then fired tear gas and stun grenades into the mosque itself while people were worshiping. Imagine this happening in St. Peter's Basilica on Easter. Imagine it happening in any synagogue anywhere in the world on the high holy days or on any important Jewish religious occasion. This was done, and those assaults on the mosque went on night after night. They reached a paroxysm 10 days ago. And this is not the first time that this has happened. And so again, it was something that naturally offended and angered people, not just in Jerusalem, not just in Palestine, but all over the Muslim world. And it was one of a series of events which in effect triggered off the high-level military attacks from Gaza into Israel, and then much more intensively by Israel into Gaza.
Thank you for giving us that summary of what's been going on, as you said, for decades. And unfortunately, those of us in the US only see it covered in the news media when hundreds, at this point, I think we've reached 227, if not more, Gazans, the vast majority of them are civilians, are killed, and almost reaching 2,000 wounded. So it's unfortunate this is the only time that we hear about these events that have been going on for decades, or these human rights violations. So let's step back and talk about the history, which you have. Your book is fabulous. I can't over promote it enough because of the level of detail in your book. In this book, The 100 Years of War in Palestine, but also your previous books. But can you tell us the historical backdrop of evictions, home demolitions, checkpoints, roads that are only for the Jewish settlers and not permitted to be used by Palestinians who are occupied in the West Bank? But can you tell us this historical backdrop of what appears to be ethnic cleansing that allows us to understand these evictions of Palestinians from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah and in East Jerusalem?
Well, I mean, there are levels of background and background. The ongoing process of colonization of the West Bank and occupied Arab East Jerusalem has been going on since 1967. The objective, using a term that the Israeli government uses, is to Judaize what is seen as part of the historic land of Israel. It is to create a reality that is unchangeable, such that Israel has taken control of and in effect annexed the entirety of the land between the Jordan River and the sea. That's the process that's been going on since 1967, since the occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. This process of colonization, however, did not begin in 1967. And the attendant theft of private and state land, the attendant dispossession of Palestinian owners of that land did not begin in 1967. This is a process that is inherent in something that started with the birth of modern political Zionism, which was the attempt to create, as a refuge for Jewish refugees from European persecution, a Jewish state in a land which, when Theodor Herzl wrote a book of that title, The Jewish State, in 1896, I should say, had an overwhelming Arab majority. In other words, Zionism attempted, for reasons that had to do with persecution of Jews in Europe, to create a Jewish majority state with sovereignty and control over immigration in an Arab majority country. That necessitated the expulsion or the removal of as much as possible of the population. That is why we had ethnic cleansing in 1948. It was not a result of the fighting. It was a result of the overwhelming need, as seen by Zionists, to create a Jewish majority in a country in which, in 1947, when the United Nations passed its partition resolution, giving most of the country, handing most of the country over to be turned into a Jewish state, had a 65% Arab majority. You can't create a Jewish majority state in most of a country with a large Arab majority. And that's the basic, that's basically why the families being evicted from their homes, or which it was projected would be evicted from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah, were not being evicted for the first time, would not have been evicted for the first time. They had already been evicted from homes in Haifa and in Jaffa back in 1948. They had already lost their property, and they were about to be evicted once again. So for Palestinians, and for anybody, frankly, anybody who's concerned with principles of justice and equality and human rights for all, what we're talking about is a system of systematic legal discrimination. There are rights that are enjoyed by one group that are not enjoyed by another group. There are property rights, there are human rights, there are political rights. And that's the situation in Palestine today. Some people enjoy full political rights, mainly Israeli Jews. Some enjoy limited political rights because of discriminatory laws passed by the Israeli state. Palestinians who live as citizens of the state of Israel. And some, 5 million Palestinians, living under occupation for 53 years, the temporary occupation that's lasted for 53 years, basically have no rights. They have no political rights over the only authority that controls everything important between the river and the sea, which is the Israeli state. So that is, I think, very quickly the background to what we were seeing in Sheikh Jarrah and what we've been seeing in the occupied territories for several decades now in terms of dispossession and eviction and either land theft or recuperation of rights, which is allowed for Israelis, but is not allowed for Palestinians.
Thank you. And I know we can't do justice to the depth of history, but I did want to kind of highlight something you talked about in your book, where you identified 4 key groups, right, that shape the fate of Palestinians, that have shaped the fate of Palestinians since the 1917 Balfour Declaration by Britain. The first is the Western powers, used to be called the Great Powers. First, it was Britain and then the United States. Currently, second, the Palestinians themselves and their various organizations and their various disagreements among the organizations, the Arab states, and then Israel. I think it's important because we have different levels of knowledge in the audience, and I think it's important to at least identify or provide an abbreviated historical backdrop of the role of Britain between 1917 and 1947, right before the 1948 war, in which Israel established itself and was recognized at that point by the United States, and then other countries followed suit. So can you tell us the key decisions or actions by the British that would seal the fate of the Palestinians as a stateless people until the present day, and why the British took these actions?
Well, this is actually an important question, because this is not just a conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. It's not just a struggle. In fact, it's not only a struggle between, two national movements or two peoples. It is and has always been an effort which was to which the great powers were absolutely essential. Without Britain, Israel could not have been established as it was established. Without the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1940s, Israel could not have been established as it was established. And in the period since then, external powers, mainly the United States, have been absolutely essential to the maintenance of a status quo which has seen Israel expand and grow stronger and stronger at the expense of the Palestinians. As far as Britain is concerned, by issuing the Balfour Declaration on November 2nd, 1917, what the British government did was, in my view, to declare war on the Palestinian people. The Palestinians at that stage were 95% of the population. The Balfour Declaration stated that the British government looked with favor on the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being understood that nothing would be done to harm the civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish communities there. This said, there is one people in Palestine with national and political rights, and there's not another people. And the other riffraff, not named, not Palestinians, not Arabs, they were just non-Jewish communities, had civil and religious rights. What did that mean? It meant they were not a nation, they were not entitled to self-determination. They had civil and religious rights, but they did not have political rights. Britain implemented the Balfour Declaration through a League of Nations mandate. So we're not just talking about Britain, we're talking about the international community in the form of the League of Nations, implementing what in effect was the dispossession of the Palestinians. A declaration that the Palestinians are not a people and do not have rights of national self-determination, even though the covenant of the League of Nations said that they should have it. They and other peoples in the former Ottoman Empire should have it. And this is the drive that enabled the Zionist movement to establish what in effect was a para-state. The mandate enabled them to create an elected assembly, enabled them to create organs of self-government, enabled them to have support for settlement on the land, for creating infrastructure, for land purchase, for unlimited immigration. In 1 year, in 1935, there were 60,000 Jewish immigrants to Palestine. Now, this was at the height of Hitler's persecution of the Jews. Palestine was a refuge. That was the same number of Jews that lived in Palestine in 1917. In 1 year, as many people arrived as many Jewish immigrants arrived as the entire Jewish population of the country in 1917. Understandably, the Palestinians were not thrilled about the idea that they had no national rights, that their country, in which they were the overwhelming majority, was not entitled to self-determination, and that another group was being supported by the international community and by Britain in this effort. So this is the beginning of what I called a war on Palestine. This is not just a conflict between Zionists and Arabs, or later on Israelis and Palestinians. This is a conflict in which Britain, for its own strategic reasons that had nothing to do with Zionism and that go way back before the Balfour Declaration, decided it needed to control Palestine, and that it needed to do this, it decided to do this through its support for the Zionist movement.
Okay, there's a lot more to it. So I know we don't have enough time. No, I understand. Again, I'm just gonna show this book because this is really a great, it's very readable, notwithstanding the extent of detail that you include. So those of you who want more, please read the book. Let's talk about the United States, which is what most of our audience is there. It's where they currently reside. It's where we all, you and I and Sarah and those of us who are hosting this reside. And this is a democracy. And we're seeing some shifts in public opinion as evinced by the massive turnout and protests across this country, also in other parts of the world. And yet, that sentiment that is at the grassroots level is not necessarily reflected in Congress, in the White House, and in formal halls of power, right? Although the polls still show, and I think there was a poll, it was in March, before the war on Gaza right now, is before the current war, and killing, let's be, the Israeli military killing civilians disproportionately, potentially in violation. I'll be charitable and say potentially in violation of international law, although I think a lot of other lawyers would say the evidence is pretty clear. When you bomb entire buildings that are 13 stories high and include international media among civilians, that in any other country or any other context, there would be international outcry, and there would be no question whether this was a violation of the law of war in terms of targeting civilians and disproportionality. So there are questions. Why is this, what are the domestic factors and the international factors that are affecting the official US position on Palestine and what seems to be an unquestioning support for Israel? It's not so much the critique isn't so much that the US supports Israel, it's that there doesn't seem to be any kind of critical analysis, any type of considering both sides, considering human rights and taking them seriously of Palestinians. But you hear these platitudes and these statements that say Israel has a right to defend itself, full stop, as if the Palestinians don't exist and their rights don't exist, and that there's no question as to what the facts on the ground are beyond kind of this generic statement. So in your expertise, what do you think are those domestic and international factors that are producing the formal US position and policies?
I think that, as with Britain, there are both strategic and domestic reasons for the United States' support for Israel, as with Britain's support of the Zionist project before World War II. The strategic reasons have changed over time. During the Cold War, for example, Israel was seen as a valuable ally or proxy against the Soviet Union. Since the so-called war on terror was launched by George W. Bush, Israel has enlisted itself as an ally, including its own enemies in the American target list, among them groups that have never done anything to the United States per se. And it is therefore seen as a strategic, has been seen for different periods and in different ways as a strategic asset for the United States. Nobody ever looks at the other side of the balance sheet, the opprobrium that accrues to the United States for what is seen as its unbalanced support of Israel and its violation of Palestinian human rights. People are systematically engaged in poo-pooing this. The Arabs don't care about Palestine and we don't care about the Arabs. But I think this goes to this issue of democracy. We're not talking about the Arab peoples. We're talking about unrepresentative, undemocratic, autocratic Arab regimes which ignore the wishes of their people and which in some cases are propped up by the United States in order to suppress their peoples. I'm talking about the regimes of the Gulf, for example. I'm talking about the regime of Egypt, for example. I'm talking about various other regimes in the Arab world, which in fact is a black hole globally where democracy is concerned. So it's not the Arabs who don't care. It's the regimes dependent on external support and devoid in many cases of any legitimacy that don't care. People in the Arab world do care, and so there is a cost, but this is never calculated by American policymakers. They talk about the governments that they deal with, and they talk about the strategic advantages. They don't talk about the strategic disadvantages. Look at polling in the Arab world about what people think about Palestine, Israel, about what people think about the United States, and you'll see that there is a cost, a severe cost to the United States over decades for this policy. The other aspect of American support for Israel, some people have reduced it to the idea of an Israel lobby. I think that's overly simplistic. I mean, the AIPAC and other elements of the lobby are clearly important as far as the legislature is concerned and as far as lobbying the administration is concerned. But I think we have to go to another level, a cultural level. A wonderful book by Amy Kaplan called Our American Israel. She was Alea Hamha, may she rest in peace. She was a brilliant cultural historian, and she talked about the cultural basis of American support for Israel. And this is a function of a successfully developed narrative over many generations, starting with the rise of modern political Zionism, rooted in the biblical narrative, dear to the hearts of American Christians and Jews, obviously, and which has been woven into a nationalist narrative, the Zionist narrative, in an enormously successful way, such that for this and many other reasons, there is and has been widespread support for Israel among people who, whether for biblical reasons or for other cultural reasons, feel sympathetic. Israel describes itself as a nation of settlers and pioneers, a nation of immigrants. The implication of settlers and pioneers is that they're holding off a hostile environment of natives. And that is how Americans, many of them at least, see American history. Americans held off hostile natives. So a lot of tropes in the Israeli narrative register with and resonate with tropes in the American national narrative. We're proud of the colonial period of American history. Israel had a colonial period too in its own historiography. One of the major institutions that was involved in acquiring land in Palestine was called, by the Zionists themselves, the Jewish Colonization Agency. This is not some anti-Semitic smear by a bunch of fanatical Arabs. This is what they called themselves. So for these and many other reasons, there's deep sympathy for Israel. Plucky little only democracy in the Middle East. Actually not true. Lebanon's a democracy, dysfunctional, corrupt, but a democracy. Kuwait is a democracy. Many, many limitations on it. Israel has ruled for 53 years over a population almost as large as its own population, which has no rights. If that's a democracy, then the Jim Crow South was a democracy, and the slaveholding South was a democracy. You had a huge population with no rights in both cases. They're not the same, obviously. Palestinians in the occupied territories are not slaves, and they're not living in the same situation of segregation and deprivation of rights as people in the Jim Crow South were. But they are similar, and to call them democracies is a travesty, frankly. But those tropes have resonance, and they're repeated endlessly by politicians. They're repeated endlessly by the media, as are other tropes. The United States is engaged in a war on terror. Israel has succeeded in painting Palestinian resistance as terror. Killing 2,200 civilians in Gaza in 2014 is not terror. Killing a dozen Israeli civilians is terror in 2014. Today, Hamas fires rockets indiscriminately, probably in violation of the rules of law, and has killed, at last count, I think about 12 Israeli civilians. Israel has killed over 220 people in the Gaza Strip, most of them civilians. That's not terrorism. It shot down 20 odd Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. That's not terrorism. No Israeli, as far as we know, has been killed in the occupied territories. So coding a certain form of violence by an occupied people, by a people that's been dispossessed as terrorism, and coding the violence done by one of the great regional superpowers, nuclear armed, with by far the best air force, not only in the Middle East, perhaps one of the best air forces in the world, and the most high-tech defense industry, perhaps on earth outside the United States. That's not terrorism. So those kinds of elements of a very carefully crafted narrative are among the many, many reasons why Israel enjoys as much support, or has enjoyed in the past as much support as it has. I think a lot of this is crumbling with younger people. It's crumbling in sectors of the Jewish community. It's crumbling among many groups that see their own struggles within the United States, Blacks, Native Americans, Latinx populations, and many others. As what's happening in Palestine is not the same as what's happening in Ferguson or what's happening in Minneapolis or what's happening at Standing Rock, but people see that there are connections. At least they understand things that destroy this mythical veil of a narrative which entirely reflects an Israeli point of view. That, in other words, I think is beginning to change.
Right. And I just want to build on what you just said on the domestic side, because as someone who focuses more on the domestic civil rights context, there are terms that are becoming more acceptable and mainstreamed, and I think from many academics' perspectives are more accurate, which are things like settler colonialism or a settler society, which the United States is, it's a fact. What we did to the Native Americans, or what people who settled from England did to the Native Americans, is documented. Similarly, systemic racism, right? And also recognizing that the attack on voting rights through gerrymandering and through impositions of, or making voting less accessible, right, and less easy through opposition to mail-in ballots. All of these attacks on civil rights that tend to either intentionally or purposely target minorities, or at least disparately impact them, people are finally recognizing, especially the young generation. And once they see that and see the world through that lens, then suddenly things in Israel and Palestine start to make more sense, as opposed to having this very Pollyannish, idealistic view that is based in large part on state propaganda by people who are in power. And so, again, I think what's important for all of us is to identify the biases in mainstream media and try to get those facts from the people who are actually experiencing the situation, rather than those who have power and have self-interest in hiding inconvenient facts and also portraying themselves as victims or heroes, when in fact they may be the perpetrators of violence. So that gets me to the Palestinians. And one of the myths about Palestinians that tends to percolate in the American mainstream media and in American culture, one is that Palestinians don't want peace, and second is that Palestinians never miss an opportunity to obtain peace or to seek peace. And there's also a homogenization, which in itself I think is racist, to assume an entire group of people all agree and that one group represents all of them is in itself a racist concept, because as we know, for example, in the United States, when one white Christian commits an act of terror, nobody then presumes that white Christians should be suspected of being potential terrorists. We identify and acknowledge, rightfully so, this is one individual who acted. And even if they are associated with others, it's just those individuals. So the concept of individual opportunity as opposed to collective punishment or guilt by association. So that brings me to the Palestinian, the internal Palestinian politics. And the Palestinians are people with a national identity tied to a distinct culture and a specific geography. They are a real people. Another myth that Palestine was a land without a people, that has clearly been debunked, where their families have lived for centuries. Like any other communities, they are diverse on multiple grounds. So can you tell us more about the origins and the rise of Hamas? Because there's a lot of talk about Hamas, and this is in some way a diversionary tactic to just focus on this one group within a very complicated ecosystem of political groups that go back all the way at least to 1917, but most certainly 1948. The backdrop of the key players in Palestinian politics post 1948, and what factors have contributed to political fragmentation among Palestinians?
I mean, that's a huge question, Zahar. I'll try and answer bits and pieces of it. I think it's important what you mentioned at the very beginning, this idea that the Palestinians don't exist, they're not a real people. There's one of the questions in the Q&A saying the Palestinians came and settled, aren't they, outsiders, interlopers? My family is documented as having lived in Jerusalem since at least the 13th or 14th century. There's some possibility that it goes back before the Crusades. Most Palestinian villages have been there. We can see this from Ottoman records going back to the 15th and 16th century, especially for a very large number. They've been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, the villages and the villagers and the family names. So this myth of the Palestinians aren't a people and they're not the indigenous population is basically the settler colonial mantra that all new coming settler colonial projects have to spin in order to justify their indigeneity at the expense of the indigenous native population. The Palestinians came to national consciousness at about the same time as most peoples in the world came to national consciousness. There were people living there. It was called Palestine in Arabic, but did they think of themselves as Palestinians? As I showed in a book that I published many years ago, like most other peoples in the Arab world, and like modern political Zionism, it's a late 19th century phenomenon and early 20th century phenomenon. Palestinian nationalism has developed in a variety of ways ever since then. It has had failures. It has suffered from poor leadership in periods like the Mandate period, the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. It suffered from almost eclipse after the 1948 war and what Palestinians call the Nakba. They call the catastrophe that led to the dissolution of Palestinian society, the destruction of much of Palestinian society after Israel expelled 750,000 Palestinians from what is today Israel. But it has also enjoyed some periods when there are some kinds of effective Palestinian leadership. Today, the Palestinians are, in my view, are at a low point. They're physically divided between different parts of former mandatory Palestine. The West Bank is isolated from Jerusalem. The Gaza Strip is isolated from the world. Palestinians inside Israel have separate status. And about half of the Palestinian people live outside of Palestine. They're the descendants of people who were driven out in 1948 or were expelled or forced to leave thereafter. Although I have to say, one of the things that has appeared in the last few weeks is a resurgence of Palestinian unity throughout the Palestinian people, whether the diaspora, whether the occupied territories, or whether inside Israel. Their national movement, however, is at a low ebb because of both these physical divisions and also because of political divisions, as between the dominant faction in the West Bank, which is Fatah, and the dominant faction in the Gaza Strip, which is Hamas. You've asked me to talk about Hamas. There are books and books and books on the subject. I cannot do justice to Hamas in 3 minutes, which I will nevertheless try and do. Hamas was established in 1987. It was an outgrowth of the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which started in Egypt in 1928. When it was first established, and in the years leading up to its foundation, it was the favored stepchild of the Israeli military occupation. Hamas, after its creation and in its earlier incarnation as the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, as is attested by a number of Israeli sources, was the chosen weapon to weaken the Palestinian national movement by creating a rival to the PLO. It soon got out of control. It soon developed on its own, but it's important to understand that the division of the Palestinians, like the division of any subjugated people, is a prime objective of the colonizer. The British did this in India. American settlers did this with Native American nations in the United States. Every colonizer, the British did this in Ireland. Every colonizer does this. It's the playbook, divide and rule, Julius Caesar, Gaul. I mean, I could go on and on. So Palestinian division is a precondition for Israel achieving certain strategic objectives. And they have done fairly well, thanks, in my view, to the failures of Palestinian leadership, both Hamas and Fatah. Their inability to see beyond their narrow political benefit to the larger benefit of the Palestinian people as a whole. Hamas came to power in Gaza as a result not of seizing power militarily, but as a result of an election in 2006, when, with the support of the United States and the EU and the assent of the Israeli government at the time, an election was held in the entirety of the occupied territories, including occupied Arab East Jerusalem. And Hamas won. They won a plurality of the vote, which, given the nature of the electoral system, produced a majority in the Palestinian Legislative Council. So you had a president who had been elected representing Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas, the same person who's still there, even though his term ended more than a decade ago. And you had a Palestinian Legislative Council with a majority supporting Hamas. The United States, Israel, and the European countries, instead of trying to deal with an elected representative, decided that these people were terrorists, they could not be dealt with, and that Palestinian disunity and the absence of an interlocutor was better than having a unified Palestinian stand, which would have negotiated with Israel. Hamas said, we're going to let the PA negotiate with Israel. We accept the idea of a 100-year truce with Israel. These are facts that are elided from the discourse on Hamas. Hamas supports a two-state solution. I am an opponent of Hamas. I am not a Hamas advocate. I have serious quarrels with Hamas's social policies, with their politics. I think they've done a terrible job of running Gaza. I think they are as bankrupt as Fatah as far as strategic vision. I have no brook for Hamas, but the lies that are pumped out every time Hamas objects to the existence of, well, Hamas, yes, has a position objecting to the state of Israel on a variety of grounds, but they support the idea of a negotiation towards a two-state solution and a long-term truce, as long as certain preconditions are met. There are a lot of people who don't know this, and the Israeli government doesn't want us to know this, because the Israeli government is run by people whose objective is to create, in the entirety of what they understand as the land of Israel, a single, unitary, Zionist state. Israel now controls the entirety of Palestine, and as far as they're concerned, that should be made permanent. And so for them, the idea of negotiating with people, whether Fatah and the PA in Ramallah or the boys in Gaza, is anathema. So for all of the things that I think it's done wrong, including the targeting of civilians indiscriminately, the weapons that Hamas uses are so inaccurate that they are necessarily indiscriminate. It's almost, it's like falling off a rock to say that these are violations of international law. Israel is using weapons that it is capable of using discriminately and is killing civilians disproportionately. Those are also war crimes on a much larger scale, 2,200 in 2014 to a dozen civilians, 2,200, most of whom were civilians. So I would argue that Hamas has done, in my view, things that are fall into the category of war crimes. I have enormous critiques of it, but I think that the way in which Hamas has been demonized in the public record is quite similar to the way every colonial power demonizes every resistance movement that fights against it with means fair or foul. The IRA, before Ireland's independence and in Northern Ireland, was demonized by the British. The ANC in South Africa was demonized by the apartheid regime. They didn't want to talk to them. They didn't like what they were doing, but the main objective was to put them beyond the pale. That's what the demonization of Hamas is about. The only reason Northern Ireland was settled, the only reason the British left Ireland in 1921, the Free State, was because the British finally broke down and sat down with them. The only reason South Africa is at peace today is because de Klerk and the apartheid regime finally agreed to sit down with the people that they'd spent decades demonizing as terrorists. I'll repeat it. I have many critiques of Hamas, but the demonization of Hamas is in this case a tool to avoid dealing with the basic realities. The basic realities are dispossession, refugee rights, Jerusalem, and equal rights for the Palestinians of national self-determination, like as the Israelis have enjoyed since 1948, and other human and civil and religious rights. Unless and until we have a solution that encompasses those rights for everybody, so that somebody doesn't have privileges just because of their ethnicity or religion, we are not going to be talking about a sustainable solution to this problem.
You're right, it's not enough time. But I have to follow up with one question, and not with the expectation that you have the silver bullet answer, but I think that many of us, including myself, the people in the audience, want to at least understand a little bit more how to analyze. What will it take, or what are the key impediments beyond, well, the key impediments to more unity among Palestinians, taking into consideration your astute observation that you and every other historian about colonized lands have pointed out, which is the divide and conquer. These are by design, very intentional. It happened in the United States as well, with vis-a-vis native tribes and other groups. But notwithstanding that challenge that Palestinians have to face, as a Palestinian American, what do you think needs to happen or could happen or should happen to mitigate some of this fragmentation, especially for purposes of trying to find a long-term solution to Palestinian self-determination?
I think the Palestinians have to have a sort of refoundation of their national movement. I think that the current parties and groups, Hamas and Fatah in particular, are obsolete and are bankrupt. They have no ideas. They have no strategy. They have no vision. The Palestinians need a strategy and a vision that can be communicated to Israelis to explain to them how we propose to live in this tiny country together with them. We don't have that now. Once upon a time, we had the two-state solution. Israel has cemented over the West Bank in what Peter Beinart called the largest infrastructure project in Israel's modern history. Roads, military installations, settlements, water, telecommunications, you name it. That is why there's not going to be very likely not to be a two-state solution. Israel has done everything possible in the past 53 years to make it impossible. Fine. How are we going to live in this country together? The Palestinians have to decide what they want. They have to unify themselves around a common platform in the 21st century. You could argue in 1988 that a two-state platform might have been feasible. It might have been feasible when we went to Madrid in 1991. I think there has to be a rethink of that. And the Palestinians have to do that, and they have to overcome the divisions in their own ranks that are mainly their fault, but which are also fomented by external actors, not just Israel or the United States or Europe, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, all have an interest in keeping the Palestinians, the regimes of those countries, all have an interest in keeping the Palestinians divided and keeping their clients within Palestinian politics. And the Palestinians have to overcome that. This is not new. This is something that the PLO had to deal with, the interference of Iraq, of Syria and Libya in particular, but also of other Arab countries. And their attempts to influence the PLO were a constant problem. And when the PLO didn't do what they wanted, those three regimes in particular, the Iraqi, Syrian, and Libyan regimes, assassinated Palestinian leaders, created fake organizations that supposedly represented the Palestinians, the Abu Nidan organization. It was a tool of all three of those regimes, and there are various others that fit that same bill. The Palestinians have to overcome that, and they have to figure out what they want and how to communicate that clearly, not just obviously to Israelis, but to the Arab public and to the world, to the United States and to Europe as well.
Yes, no easy solution. Now, this gets us to another major stakeholders, which is the Arab countries in the Middle East. Another lecture in and of itself. But I think it's important for people to understand at least the contours of how to analyze this, because another myth, right, is that, again, there's no difference between a Palestinian and an Egyptian and a Jordanian and a Lebanese and a Syrian, and why don't they all just move there and get citizenship, and they don't have their own unique cultural, ethnic identity. And therefore, it's the Arab state's fault that they're not taking them in. So that's one myth/critique. But what is the role of the Arab states? And obviously each country is different. And just to kind of put a little bit of a timeline, which feel free to correct me on this, but it seems that 1967 was a watershed moment in terms of the official state policies starting to shift, right? With the Arab-Israeli war and the defeat of Egypt and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and their armies, but particularly the beginning of the decline of Nasserism, Arab nationalism. And then at that point, you see the 1979, I mean, 13 years later or 12 years later, the peace deal between Egypt and Israel. And then in the 1990s, there's a formal peace deal between Jordan and Israel. And your book is very critical of the role of the Jordanian government as far back as 48 because of their own, the king's own motivations, right, for controlling at least what is now currently the West Bank. and possibly even all of what is now Israel. But could you tell the audience a little bit more about the regional politics and why the Arab states, at least in this point in time, have abandoned essentially Palestinian self-determination and turned a blind eye to their basic human rights? In contrast to what you mentioned, the population has very different sentiments, but they're living in dictatorships, so the population's sentiments don't matter. But at least let's talk about the states.
Well, I think you've sort of answered your own question with the last thing you said, Saha. The reason Arab governments don't support the Palestinians, in spite of the fact that their peoples do, which we could see in many Arab countries in the last few days. I mean, the demonstrations in Jordan, the demonstrations in Lebanon, the demonstrations in a number of other Arab countries, and the fact that during the Arab uprisings, Palestinian flags were being waved in Cairo, in Algiers, whether the ones of 2011 or the ones of 2019, just before the pandemic, are an indication that Arab opinion is very strongly supportive of the Palestinians. And when as many people are being massacred as is happening today in Gaza, that comes out in a way that's impossible to deny. It is systematically denied because people don't care what the Arabs think. They care what the governments think. So let's talk about the governments. We are talking about governments which, in contrast to every other part of the world where democratization of some form has taken place over the last 30 or 40 years. I lived in South Korea when it was a dictatorship. Taiwan was a dictatorship. Countries of Southeast Asia, Indonesia was a dictatorship. And you could go, Pakistan, you could go country by country through Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe under communist dictatorships in the 80s or 90s. Most of these countries are democracies now. That transformation has not happened in the Arab world. Most Arab countries are ruled by dictatorial, autocratic governments, in some cases, the only absolute monarchies on earth, which arrogate to themselves whatever share of the resources of those countries they choose to steal, which, because of their lack of domestic legitimacy, are dependent on the sole superpower, the United States, for military support against both their own peoples and their external enemies, and which don't care about anything but their self-preservation. They don't care about Palestine. They don't care about their own peoples, even more importantly. This is the core problem. And it is a problem that the Palestinians obviously can't solve, and we can't solve, Americans can't solve. This is a problem the Arab peoples are going to have to deal with. There are all kinds of reasons for this. I have no time. We have no time. We only have a half an hour left to go into them. But it's a problem that the Palestinians in the past have tried to deal with by going over the heads of the governments to the publics and forcing the governments to do things that they're otherwise unwilling to do. And they become embarrassed when they see scenes. And, you know, when they could control the media, as these dictatorships do, when, you know, all you had was Syrian state TV and the Assad regime could lie as it wished, or the Sisi regime could lie as it wished, or the Saudi regime could lie as it wished, they had a certain degree of control over their peoples. The images their peoples had access to. It's not true anymore. Thanks to social media, thanks to things like YouTube, in spite of the interdiction of these things by sophisticated regime surveillance techniques, people are seeing what's happening. That's happening in the United States as well. People are not able to unsee what they've seen. The media can stop them from seeing some of this stuff, but they're seeing it. You know, when a settler is asked by a woman in Sheikh Jarrah, "Why are you stealing my house?" And he says, "Well, if I don't steal it, somebody else will." The nature of the thing is revealed to everybody who saw that YouTube video. There are millions who saw it. And the same thing is happening in the Arab world. They know what Israel is doing. They're seeing what the Israelis are saying. They're seeing what the Palestinians are saying. They're seeing what the international news media are saying. And they're seeing what every single person in Palestine who has a cell phone is capable of showing them. And they're able to read a vast array of things in Arabic and English and French across the Arab world. And so the regimes have a problem, which the Palestinians, I think, are when and if we develop a more coherent national movement, this will actually be much more effective. But even today, Palestinian civil society, which is leading the resistance, frankly, it's not Hamas or Fatah that are leading the Palestinian cause. In many cases, in my view, they are hindering the Palestinian cause, both Hamas and Fatah. by their disunity, if nothing else. But it is Palestinian civil society that is leading this. And it's young people like Mohammed al-Kurd and Sheikh Jarrah, and the young women who I see speaking from Gaza on YouTube and on other channels, sometimes even on mainstream corporate media. And that is until and unless democracy finally prevails in the Arab world. And it's going to be an uphill struggle. It is the last holdout in the entire globe. Think about it. Think about how many Latin American dictatorships and Central American dictatorships there were 40 years ago, and how few they are by comparison. Think of the same thing with regard to much of Africa, the same thing with regard to other parts of the world. The Arab world is a black hole where democracy is concerned. And that is an enormous asset to Israel, and it's an asset to the United States, because these regimes are dependent on external support. Why did Gulf regimes normalize with Israel? They were so afraid of Iran and so afraid of their own people that they considered Israel a potential ally. This is changing now, partly because they've come to their senses and they're beginning to restore their bilateral relations with Iran. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are talking to the Iranians, they're talking to the Turks, and so on and so forth. Egypt is now talking to Turkey after a long period where they weren't talking. So some of these regional issues are being resolved, even as we speak, hopefully. But that lack of legitimacy and lack of democracy among these regimes in the Arab world is a fundamental problem for the Palestinians, and obviously more importantly for these peoples themselves. As we could see in 2011, 2012, 2013, when people rose up in the face of ferocious repression, as we saw again in 2019 in Algeria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in the Sudan. So that the aspiration of the Arab peoples for democracy it's manifest. But the forces that repress them are extraordinarily powerful. They're fueled by unlimited petrodollars from the absolute monarchies of the Gulf, and they're supported ferociously by the United States and by Europe. It has to be said. Not one arms sale to one repressive Arab regime has been interrupted by Great Britain, by France, or by the United States. So we are talking about externally supported, illegitimate, undemocratic regimes, which also happen to be unsupportive of the Palestinians. But it's part of a larger problem.
So this brings us to, it's connected to the domestic realm. I want to bring us back a little bit, because there are various extensions, and what I call is importing the Arab-Israeli, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict into US domestic politics, but not simply at the high level, Congress and the White House, but even at university campuses, right, at college campuses, and through state legislatures. And it's coming out in various ways. So one is the very strong aversion and opposition to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And second is the blacklisting and malicious targeting of college students and college professors through defamation, through slander, through libel, through attacks on their job security and attempts to tarnish their reputation. There's a lot of lawfare going on, which is using law as a weapon, as a nonviolent weapon to eliminate your opposition in terms of their employment and livelihood and reputations. And that's alive and well, and it's causing a lot of self-censorship and fear in a country that claims to be one of the world's leading democracies. And this is something we have to confront, even at my university, at your university. We could write books about the various ways in which Arab professors, Palestinian American, Arab American professors are attacked, and their students, as well as white allies, Jewish allies, African American allies. We saw what happened with Mark Lamont Hill by just saying 4 words that were taken completely out of context when he gave a speech at the UN about Palestinian human rights. So on the one hand, we live in a country that is, at least on that issue, is not democratic. There isn't a free marketplace of ideas. And on the other hand, all of these forms of dissent are nonviolent. So you have these attacks on Hamas and on the use of rockets, killing civilians, which is absolutely against the law of war, right? You cannot target civilians in a conflict, right? Whether it's from Israel, whether it's Hamas, of course, the degree is different, but that's just a red line. And so you have this alternative movement now opposition movement, which is nonviolent, which is BDS, economic boycott. It happened against the apartheid regime of South Africa. And in fact, many African Americans were a big part of that movement that ultimately contributed towards the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa. And I think Americans need to face that reality, the hypocrisy that is on our own soil, not over there, over here.
Right.
And so how do you assess that situation? And what's your analysis, not just on BDS, but this really aggressive, bad faith, malicious, anti-democratic, and highly Islamophobic, and highly anti-Arab racist attacks on people who simply just want to provide different perspectives and different facts, or what they think are the facts, to a really important conversation?
Well, I think that the Palestine question has been part of American domestic politics for a very long time. As you say, President Truman said to a group of American diplomats brought back to Washington from Arab capitals, "Gentlemen, I have a lot of people concerned for the fate of the Zionist project. I don't have anybody who cares about the Arabs," basically. That was 1946, I think. And it still is. And you have had, as I said earlier, crafted in this country quite brilliantly, a narrative which entirely puts forward the Israeli point of view. And that is one that most politicians of both parties, certainly senior politicians, and most of the owners, the corporate owners of the media, and the producers and the people who run the media accept in large part. And what has happened in recent years is that, in particular, younger people, minorities, people of, not just people of color, but also people of faith, people who support human rights, have come to see that there is another narrative that has to be placed against that hegemonic narrative. And they have come up against, as you say, ferocious resistance, in particular, as they have achieved success, as group after group, in particular of younger people, vote for example, divestment of their university from companies that support the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. We had a vote here at Columbia, overwhelming support. Barnard College, overwhelming support. Brown University, overwhelming support. University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, overwhelming support. The people who have been the gatekeepers of the right views on this have gone into overdrive. A multi-million-dollar campaign of lawfare, of slander, of online harassment, of organization of, and organization of real groups. These are not AstroTurf groups. These are real groups of people who believe that Israel is in danger and are mobilized against this campaign that is growing around not just boycott, divestment, and sanctions, but groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, Palestine Human Rights Campaign, many others, mobilized against this rising tide of people who are seeking justice for Palestinians, and also peace, but a peace based on justice. And I think it has to be said that there's something particularly grotesque about people who complain about violence, in some cases justly. They don't complain about violence on both sides, but they're right in principle to complain about violence. They don't mind Israeli violence, they mind Palestinian violence, who then launch these kinds of savage, vicious, underhanded campaigns to oppose nonviolent opposition to Israel. And I remember somebody in Palestine saying, if you don't want us to be violent and you don't want us to be nonviolent, you just want us to lie down and let the bulldozer roll over us? I mean, seriously, what do you want us to do? And I'm particularly struck by the opposition to BDS insofar as boycott is concerned, because, and also for that matter, divestment, because boycott is as American as apple pie. You would not have had a civil rights movement. You would not have had desegregation. You would still have Jim Crow were it not for boycott. Ireland would still be under British rule were it not for boycott. Now, the Irish employed many, many means besides boycott, but boycott is named for a British land agent who was oppressing Irish peasants who boycotted him Ireland would not be free. South Africa would not be free. The American South would not be free were it not for boycott. I mean, India would not be free. Gandhi and the Congress Party engaged in boycott of British goods. So the opposition to this is mind-boggling to me as an American, as somebody who has watched and has studied liberation struggles the globe over, India, South Africa, Ireland. What can be more iconic than those three struggles? Boycott was central to them, as it is central to an attempt to educate people in the United States about what's going on. I don't think that there are going to be sanctions tomorrow. I doubt that a lot of institutions will divest, although some are. I don't think that boycotts are going to necessarily be effective every place and every time that they're called for, but they force people to confront issues that have been buried by this barrage of propaganda, by this narrative, this hegemonic narrative that's been imposed, and which is crumbling before our eyes. It crumbles in particular, again, I go back to the wonderful book by Amy Kaplan, it crumbles in particular when Palestinians are bleeding. It crumbled in 1982, and you had people saying, this is not the Israel I know on network television, when they watched Israel bombard entire buildings, bringing them down just as they're bringing them down in Gaza today. The destruction of entire buildings because of an alleged presence of some alleged terrorist is an old Israeli tactic. They're using the same weapons. They've been using the same weapons, probably more sophisticated. That kind of thing, you see it, you can't unsee it. Mark Regev can lie on the BBC or lie on NPR until the cows come home. And whatever he says doesn't cover up for the fact that Israel is targeting civilians. And those kinds of things those things that have been seen cannot be unseen, and things that have been learned cannot be unlearned. And that is leading to a grassroots wave in the United States. Journalists are talking about it. It's in the New York Times. It's everywhere. Even the mainstream corporate media is talking about it. And so the guardians of the status quo, which is a status quo of continued eternal occupation, let us say, of unending settler colonialism, the people who are protecting that reality are frantic, are hysterical, are employing all the means at their disposal. And that's why academics are targeted, lose their jobs. That's why programs are shut down or are deplatformed from Facebook. That's why accounts are hacked. That's why undergraduates are defamed publicly. That's why campus organizations are shut down by universities in an illegal and unfair manner. Under the pressure of this hysterical, frantic attempt to maintain in place a wall of a narrative that is crumbling in spite of all of the efforts of its proponents. And I have to say, this has been accelerating as a result of this last war on Gaza, as a result of what happened in Sheikh Jarrah, as a result of what happened in Al-Aqsa. A lot more people have figured out a lot more about this. And, Israel has been very successful with its allies in the United States of rebuilding these walls after 1982, after the first Intifada, after the war on Lebanon in 2006, after the 2014 attack on Gaza. But there's an accretion, there is an accumulation of understanding among some people at least. And that is beginning to change the media scape, and it's beginning to change the political landscape. I think we should go to questions, Sahar.
Well, I've actually been including those questions as I've been incorporating them as I read, and those of you on will see live. One question that's come up quite a bit, and it actually ends well here, is what to do from here, where to go from here. How do we move forward? Are we forced to choose between ethnic cleansing, permanent apartheid, or a one-state solution at this point, since it seems that Israel, the state of Israel, the government of Israel and its official policy has made it nearly impossible to have a two-state solution that is not a state that's a real state, as opposed to essentially an occupied state that's called a state. So what do you make? I guess part of that is, where do we go from here? But taking into account the national and international protests, this last weekend commemorating the Nakba, and also protesting the murder of, now we're at over 227 Gazans, most of whom are civilians. But what do you advise for, we have 400, we reached our capacity over 500. We had 1,500 people registered. We're on Facebook Live. We have hundreds watching. People are clearly seeing what you talked about. They're seeing the citizen journalism. They're seeing for themselves that the Israeli propaganda, and I say state propaganda, is similar to the US propaganda when they would tell us, well, that black man got shot because he was armed. Well, that black man got shot because he was a threat. He resisted arrest. And the police rarely, if ever, murder black men in cold blood. And we saw the videos, and we've just gone through a historic trial, right, of the murder of George Floyd by a police officer who was actually indicted and then actually convicted. This is unheard of, and even though we're in 2021. And that was because people are saying for themselves that this is state propaganda, right? The US is a state and engages in its own propaganda. And when it's vulnerable communities, subordinated communities, minority communities, it's so much easier to successfully use that propaganda to convince people that they're bad people, right? They deserve the discrimination and violence against them. So I think against that shift, right, in domestically by young people who can no longer or are not willing to practice the long tradition of progressive except for Palestine, right, PEP. And those of you who haven't read the book by Mark Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plitnick, I Except for Palestine, the limits of progressive politics, I would recommend it. We actually hosted them, CSR hosted them, and you can watch their recording as well as read their book.
It's a great book.
So what do you think, Dr. Khalidi? What advice do you have for our audience, especially those who live in the United States?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to arm yourself with knowledge. You can't get involved in something like this on the basis of ignorance. And there's a lot of ignorance on the pro-Palestinian side. There's religious bigotry. There's some anti-Semitism. I think we have to fight that within our own communities, all of our communities, whichever one that may be. And you have to be knowledgeable. You have to understand this is not about Jews and Muslims. This is not about something in the Bible or the Quran. The Bible and the Quran are relevant in a certain way, but that's not what it's about. And we have to understand those things, and we have to, how shall I say, work with our allies to deal with manifestations that are intolerable. But we also have to know a great deal about the background and the facts. And so, I mean, I'm a historian. I think that you really need to know a little bit of the history. So I'm glad that you've done this so that I can talk a little bit about some of the background to the things that are in the headlines. I think the second thing we have to do is to understand that the United States is a party to this conflict. It is an actor on the side of Israel against the Palestinian people. It is not an honest broker. It is not a fair mediator. In the words of Aaron David Miller, who was one of the senior American officials involved in negotiations, it has acted as Israel's lawyer. The lawyer works for its client. The lawyer is not an impartial mediator. And the United States is not and has never been an impartial actor in this conflict. It's sometimes been slightly less biased and sometimes much more biased, for example, under Trump. But we have to understand we are a party to this. We supply Israel with our tax dollars, with $3.8 million worth of war material. That equipment is supposed to be used in terms of the Leahy amendments to the Foreign Aid Acts for defensive purposes. The mantra of Israel has a right to self-defense is in part a defense of the politicians who vote for this. Because if Israel is not using these weapons for self-defense, they are violating the law, and Israel is violating the law. And so I think we should press on these things. Are these weapons being used for self-defense? If they're being used in the occupied West Bank, how is that self-defense? If they're being used to kill civilians, how is that self-defense? I think we should be interrogating ourselves, reading about it, learning about it, and interrogating our elected representatives about these things. I would make the same argument about the delivery of weapons to a country like the Emirates or to a country like Saudi Arabia, which have been engaged in wars all over the Arab world, in Yemen, in Libya. I would make the same argument with regard to Egypt. I would make the same argument with regard to any recipient of US arms. which is engaged in egregious violations of human rights. It's not just using weapons for purposes that cannot under any circumstances be described as defensive. It's using arms, it's delivering arms to countries that are gross violators of human rights. The Egyptian regime is a gross violator of human rights. So are every one of the governments I've mentioned, not just Israel. They're all violators of human rights. We should come down like a ton of bricks on our representatives and make sure that they understand that. There's one other thing I think we can do, which is to raise questions about the tax-exempt 501c3 status of American organizations which raise money and funnel it for the building of illegal settlements or other illegal settlement activity in the occupied territories. The transfer of an occupying power's population to territories under occupation is illegal. The United Nations has voted on it. The Fourth Geneva Convention is clear about it. Everything Israel has done to put over 700,000 of its citizens into the occupied West Bank and occupied Arab East Jerusalem and the occupied Syrian Golan Heights is a gross violation of international law. We are financing that by allowing American 501c3 charities to funnel hundreds of millions of dollars to this illegal settlement activity. That can be changed by a stroke of the pen by the Treasury Department. Congress doesn't even have to act. You don't even have to fight AIPAC on this one. But somebody has to develop a little bit of courage in government and look carefully at some of the settler groups that are dispossessing people in East Jerusalem, some of the settler groups that are building settlements, including settler groups, including groups that are supported by former President Trump's personal lawyers, whom he appointed his ambassador and his envoy, his ambassador to Israel and Zon. They are on the boards of trustees of some of these 501c3s. Why do these people not pay taxes and we pay taxes? We pay taxes in order for Israel to acquire tax-free weaponry, whereas they don't pay taxes in order for settler groups to take over Palestinian land and property and dispossess their owners. Those are the kinds of things that can be done. We can also fight laws in state legislatures and nationally that would criminalize speech, like the laws against BDS. I mean, you talked about it better than I could, and you're a lawyer, so you're the one who should talk about it. But there are people who would love to shut down anybody who says anything about Palestine. And they'll do it through means fair or foul, including means that are gross violations of the First Amendment to our Constitution. We should not stand up for that. Absolutely not. You know, people can say what they want, as long as it doesn't incite violence, as long as it fits the rules that we all know. And advocating a nonviolent approach to the state of Israel, which is a foreign country, for God's sakes. It's not the 51st state yet. It is a foreign country. Advocating that we boycott this or we divest from that should be protected speech. You may like it, you may dislike it, you may agree with it, you may disagree with it, you may refuse to do it. That's fine. But to say, as state legislatures have done, that you cannot have an abortion in Texas and you also cannot be an employee of the state of Texas if you support BDS. That's unconstitutional. That's a violation of the First Amendment. And those are the kinds of things that we should fight. Everybody should have the right to advocate. If they want to advocate for Israel, they should, of course, have that right. And if they want to advocate for Palestine, they should, of course, have that right. So I think there are a lot of things we can do if we recognize that our country is a party to this. We are responsible for what is happening. Those are American planes. Those are American JDAM bombs that are being dropped. I don't know what JDAM stands for. Sounds like something awful. I should find out. There's $735 million worth of the things being sent that are about to be sent over to replenish the Israeli arsenal because they used up so many of them bombing Gaza in the last 10 or 12 days. Those are the kinds of things that should be questioned. I think Senator Sanders is tabling a resolution, which I think is going to be supported in the House as well by a similar House resolution, which would call into question that specific arms sale. But I don't think it's a matter of a specific arms sale, important though that is, obviously. It's a matter of understanding that we are a party to this conflict. We are helping Israel in what it does, whether it's dispossession, whether it's settlement, whether it's firing tear gas grenades into the mosque, the third holiest mosque in Islam, while people are worshiping during the month of Ramadan. We are responsible for those things. When Ferguson was being attacked, by the police. The kids in the West Bank watched YouTube videos of what was happening in the streets, and they started sending tips to the demonstrators, the Black Lives Matter demonstrators, because they said, I recognize those tear gas canisters. The Israelis use the same one. What you should do is this, that, and the other. So if it's our tear gas canisters that are fired into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, I don't know that it was, then we are responsible for gassing people trying to pray during one of the nights of Ramadan. So there are many, many things we can do. First, learn more about this. Understand some of the tropes that are used to disguise the reality. And understand how to debate in a respectful way. Understand how to deal with some of the noxious elements among supporters of Palestine, of whom there are some. It must be dealt with. It must be dealt with. This is a big problem in Europe, and it's a problem in this country as well. We have to deal with it. But you do that through education, through community education, through self-education. And I think that's the most important thing we can do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khalidi. And on that note, please support the Center for Security, Race, and Rights by donating. Social justice requires a moral commitment and money to transform that moral commitment into action. So all of our events are free, but for those who can afford it, go to csrr.rutgers.edu, press the donate button and give whatever you can. We are actually in the process of creating a Palestine project so that we can have more information, more debates, more discussions, hopefully in person, not just virtually, hosting esteemed experts like Dr. Rashid, Khalidi, and many others who don't get asked necessarily to go on mainstream media because mainstream media has its own form of internal censorship. But what I always tell my students and people that I engage with who want to know more is invest in institutions, support institutions. No one can make change alone. And if you want to go far, go together. And so there is the Center for Security, Race, and Rights is one of those centers. We will be sending out after this event, in addition to the recording, but also a fact sheet, or excuse me, a resource guide of different institutions that focus primarily on Palestine. And they will give you, there's plenty out there. It's just a matter of finding it, because it is very intentional that those academic and analytical sources are not easily available, but they do exist. And before I turn it over to my co-sponsoring organization, my colleague, Sarah Lee Whitson at Dawn, Democracy for the Arab World Now, and just note that title, For the Arab World, I want to highlight a key point. It is absolutely not anti-Semitic to criticize a state. This is a state, it is a nation state. It has laws and courts and police and a military. It wants to be treated like every other state. And part of being treated like a state is that you can and should be criticized by your own people, your own citizens, including those you occupy who are not citizens, and by foreigners in other countries. It is not treasonous to criticize the US government. And it is not anti-Semitic to criticize a state. It is not Islamophobic to criticize Egypt, which I've done much of in my own writing, and I'm from Egypt. It is not Islamophobic to criticize the state of Saudi Arabia. It is not Islamophobic to criticize the state of Iran. And it is not anti-Semitic to criticize the state of Israel and its policies and its practices. And that really is a red herring, and it's a non-starter. So I just want to make sure that we all understand that, because this is an academic setting and we are focused on seeking the truth in pursuit of our values. And at least for us, our values are human rights for all, whether you're Jewish, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Christian, whether you're Arab, whether you're American, Native American, African American. So we are driven by our principles. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Sarah Lee Whitson to highlight. Oh, before I do that, Dr. Khalidi, one more remark. Yes.
The last remark is this. Thank you very much for doing this. I have to duck out. I have another commitment at 1:30. So I'll let Sarah Lee Whitson conclude with a pitch for that organization, which I think is really important in light of some of the things that I just said. You're not going to have change in the Middle East, whether in Palestine or elsewhere, unless and until the situation in the Arab countries changes for the better as far as democracy is concerned. Thanks to everybody for sitting in, and thank you all for organizing this. I appreciate it. I unfortunately have to leave to do another event. I apologize.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Ma'asalama. Thank you.
Allah send me.
All right, Sarah, the floor is yours.
I will unmute first, just to thank you again, Sahad, for organizing this event. I actually really enjoyed hearing Rashid and some of the arguments that he made, which I thought were spot on, and some of the analysis, the historic analysis that we presented. I want to just circle back to the question you asked him and leave it with our participants today, which is, what we can do and what we can do in response to the devastating events that have motivated you all to take an hour and a half of your day to listen in on this call. And I would say if there's one thing you can do that shouldn't take more than 2 minutes of your time, it's to call your senator and demand that they support Bernie Sanders' resolution, and to call your Congress member and demand that they support AOC's resolution. The resolutions that they have put forward are historic. It has never happened before that we have had a congressional resolution demanding a halt to arms to Israel. This is a violation of America's own human rights responsibilities and American law that prohibit us from providing military support to a systematically abusive government, which Israel is. And our Congress members need to hear from us. If they don't hear from us, they think we don't care. So please pick up the phone and take 2 more minutes of your day to make that call. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks, everyone. One more final pitch. It requires funds and money to do social justice. So we're just asking everyone, please go on csrr.rutgers.edu, make a donation, whatever amount you can, and also use our resource page. We have academic resources, policy researches, multimedia resources, and media resources. So if you go to our resource page. And then finally, if you are on social media, follow us on Twitter at RUCSRR, Instagram, Rutgers CSRR, and Facebook.com/RUCSRR. And with that, we thank you for your time. Keep educating yourself, keep using your critical thinking skills, search for facts, search for the truth. Don't believe anything anyone tells you, including what was told in this panel. Read for yourself and find out for yourself. And any of you all who want to become lawyers, contact me at Rutgers Law School, because we train and create and prepare social justice lawyers as part of our tradition, and we're very proud of it. So with that, I say goodbye, ma'as salama, go with peace, and we'll see you at our next lecture.